Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel where history is always fun and sometimes scary. Today's topic is quite simply one of my favorite topics in all of medieval history, and I feel like it's been criminally underrepresented here on YouTube. So today we're going to talk about the forgotten rebellion that changed the fate of the Middle Ages. Now this is a 4-part series I'm doing, so if you enjoy this first episode today, which is an introduction to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, then be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next 3 episodes. In May of 1381, England was about to get a brand new king. Richard II, just 10 years old, was the chosen heir of the late Edward III, and as such he was going to take the throne following his grandfather's death. But as is typical for young heirs who haven't yet come of age, Richard was not going to rule alone. His father, the Duke of York, would serve as regent until Richard came of age, and as such he was put in charge of collecting taxes to ensure there would be enough money to pay for the young king's lavish coronation. Now, ever since Edward I conquered England in 1272, the barons had grown increasingly resentful over how the king kept raising taxes to pay for wars, building projects, and basically anything else he wanted. And when Edward III died, those resentments didn't just go away, they had continued to grow and fester. And now these barons were ready to revolt. Okay, so let me stop right there because I know what you're thinking. Wait, what happened to the serfs? Where are they in all this? Are they the ones rebelling? Well, believe it or not, no, it was actually the English peasants who were tired of being taxed by the nobility and the king that revolted in 1381. It was a massive uprising that saw hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of peasants march on London, burn fields of grain, loot noble estates, and kill anyone who stood in their way. And to make matters worse for the nobles, the peasant army was led by a charismatic rebel named Wat Tyler, who was able to rally the peasants by promising them a future without serfdom, taxation, or royal authority. He demanded the release of all English peasants from their feudal obligations and the abolition of all recent taxes imposed on the peasantry. So why did the peasants revolt? Well, it was pretty much because they were sick and tired of being screwed over by the English nobility and monarchy. So let's go ahead and dive into that. In England during the Middle Ages, the vast majority of people were peasants. In fact, in the year 1381, something like 90% of the population were peasants. Now, peasants during the Middle Ages are usually thought of as being serfs, and that's not entirely inaccurate. Serfdom had been reintroduced to England with the Norman conquest in 1066, and it persisted throughout the Middle Ages. Essentially, the English serfs were tied to the land they worked, and they couldn't leave unless their lord gave them permission. They also had to pay rent in order to stay on the land. That rent could be paid in cash or in kind, meaning that instead of paying rent in silver or gold, the serfs could instead pay it using crops or other goods that they produced on their farms. Now, serfdom was bad, but many of the English peasants were actually free peasants. This meant that they were not tied to any particular piece of land, and they were allowed to travel and move at will. However, there was a catch to this freedom. While they could move around freely, they still had to pay various taxes to the king and the nobility for the privilege of being alive in England. The English monarchy had always levied some sort of tax on the peasantry, but the taxes became more burdensome after the 100 Years' War began in 1337. The war between England and France would rage for the next 100 years, and it was extremely expensive. To fund their efforts in France, the English monarchs raised taxes on the peasantry. The problem was that while the 100 Years' War was going on, the English peasants' lives became increasingly difficult. There were widespread famines throughout Europe during the 1340s and 1350s, thanks to a series of poor harvests, and these famines hit England hard. By the time the Black Death arrived in 1348, things were already bad, and this plague would only make things worse. The Black Death killed something like half of the English population, and it caused food prices to soar. Meanwhile, wages for farm laborers stayed low, and the English nobility responded to the increased prices by raising rents and taxes on the peasantry. And so, in response to the economic crisis facing England, the English peasants did what any reasonable group of people would do. They started a rebellion. Okay, so with all of that being said, let's finally answer the question I posed at the beginning of this video. Why is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 considered to be one of the most important events in medieval history? Well, let's talk about that. When the peasants seized London in June of 1381, it looked like they might actually win. Wat Tyler and his rebels executed Archbishop Sudbury, who had been a staunch supporter of the heavy taxes that were levied against the peasants. And Wat Tyler even forced his way into a meeting with King Richard II. But as is often the case in medieval rebellions, once the peasants got into a position of power, they didn't really know what to do next. After Archbishop Sudbury's execution, the rebels turned their attention to John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and forced him to flee London. Then they ransacked the Savoy Palace, which belonged to the nephew of Pope Gregory XI. They also burned the manor houses of nobles who had fled the city, and they released all of the prisoners from Newgate Prison, which was one of London's main jails. Richard II was only 10 years old when the peasants seized London, and he was terrified. His counselors urged him to flee, but his mother, the Dowager Queen Isabella of France, told him to stay put and negotiate with the rebels. So that's what Richard did. On June 30th, 1381, Richard met with Wat Tyler and agreed to meet some of the rebels' demands. Under the terms of their agreement, serfdom was to be abolished in England, and the peasants would be allowed to keep any valuables they looted during their rebellion. But when Richard attempted to break up the crowd, he accidentally pulled his horse's rein over Tyler's head, killing him instantly. With their leader dead, the remaining rebels scattered, and the peasants' revolt of 1381 came to an end. This rebellion was important because it was the last major attempt to overthrow the English monarchy that would occur during the Middle Ages. It showed the world that the days of peasant rebellions were over, and it also revealed how weak the English monarchy really was. Thanks to the efforts of the peasants, King Richard II was forced to sign the 1381 Charter, which granted English peasants many of the freedoms they had been demanding. Serfdom was officially abolished, and many of the oppressive taxes and fees that burdened the peasantry were repealed. And so the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is remembered as a watershed moment in English history. It marked the end of the Middle Ages in England and the beginning of the modern era. Well, that brings us to the end of this first episode in my 4-part series on the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Next time, we're going to talk about the early life of Wat Tyler and how he grew to become one of the most famous rebels in medieval history. So if you enjoyed this first episode, then please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Also, if you want to learn more about medieval history, then check out my podcast, Medieval Warfare. New episodes premiere every Wednesday. You can listen on various platforms. And with all that being said, I would like to thank my supporters for their continued support. And I would also like to welcome our newest member. Thank you both so much for supporting my channel and allowing me to bring these videos to all of you. So as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.